have been done in the name of God. Many good things have been done in the name of God. And some not so good things have been done in the name of God. And how do we know if the message that we are receiving is a message from God or not from God? I think it has to do with this. When the Spirit directs us towards God, that is, directs us towards the person of Jesus Christ, the man who walked and lived and who set an example of what it means to be a child of God. I think that's a good illustration of what it means to recognize this person has the Spirit of God upon him. But when the Spirit gives us the idea or the notion that we are God, or that we think like God, or believe that we are ourselves God, that is a spirit of deception. Often it's easy for us to be confused with what the message from God is and what the message not from God is. And I've seen time and time again when God's name has been used for horrible things, as well as I'm sure many of you have seen. The Spirit must recognize the person of Jesus Christ, and that is what John is saying in this message here today. He's saying that the Spirit must in some way acknowledge not just some unknown thing, but to acknowledge Jesus in the form in which he was known by, the personhood of Jesus, that he was a man who walked, who was a son of God, who lived out love. One of my favorite passages in Scripture comes from John chapter 3, verse 17, which says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world." And often we hear a message of God condemns this and God condemns that. God does have harsh judgments for us at times, but those judgments are like the judgments of a parent, a loving parent who uses it as a tool to direct his or her children in a path that leads them back to, being right again, because they've fallen into temptation or fallen into the practice of something that is not right. It is not the practice of eternal condemnation. It is loving grace that God communicates to us, and so anyone who has the Spirit of God should communicate a message with grace, even though from times there may be sharp decisions that need to be made, and there may need to be correction at times as God corrects us, as a loving parent does. But to be able to discern the love and grace is what helps us to understand that the message is from God. As I said, many people have done many things in the name of God, both good and bad. And one of the things that's happened is as false messages have been given over the years, as John encountered in his time, it has weakened the understanding of what is the true message of God. And that's one of the things that the early Christians struggled with, is what is the true message of God? Because we hear so many different messages being bombarded at us each day. How do we know who has the authority to speak on God's behalf? That's not an easy question to answer. Who speaks on God's behalf? John says if they listen to us, and he's speaking to the apostles that are in Jerusalem and those who have been commissioned by the apostles in Jerusalem, he says if they listen to us, then you know that they are of God. There were many people out there that were not commissioned by the apostles to be agents that spoke, but rather folklore was becoming mingled into the church, and one of the things that came out of it is that people didn't know who to listen to or who to trust. We see that in our world today. We see many people speaking and saying that they speak in the name of God, but we don't know by what authority they have the right to speak what they speak. The process towards ordination is a long and treacherous process. And anyone that doesn't go through that long and treacherous process, not that God can't speak to them, but I am a little bit more skeptical of God speaking to them. Because it says that we are to test the Spirit of God. And for those who are called to proclaim the message of God, I think that process of ordination is an important process because it is trial and tribulation. It is no easy thing to do. To give you an idea of what that process is like, I'll share with you a little bit of the process that I had to go through. 4 years of college, 4 years of a master's program, 2 years of in-care, 1 year of field education, examination by 4 different groups on 4 separate occasions, and still, even afterwards, continuous examination was the criteria and requirements to be able to maintain standing. Because even though a person is ordained, their authority to speak comes from the standing of the church, and so they are examined by both those who are ordained and those who are lay folks in the church. And only then are they given the standing to be able to have the authority to speak on the behalf of God. Test the Spirit. Test those who claim to have a message of God, because God does not speak to us alone. Rather, God speaks to us in community. As God spoke to the apostles and through Jesus Christ, that the message was not carried by one messenger, but by many messengers. As I said, many things have been done in the name of God, and we often question, how do we know if this is God's message or not? It creates a spirit of deception, a spirit of mistrust when false messages are proclaimed, and we are all susceptible to it. It causes anarchy. It causes a sense of chaos. This past year I was reading a book by a boy by the name of Ishmael Bey. I don't know how many of you have read the book, but it's called Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. He talks about his life growing up in Sierra Leone in the middle of the Civil War. And one of the things that he talks about in the book is he says, it gets to a point where there's no trust in the community. No one knows who has authority. No one even knows who the government officials are. And so the entire society of Sierra Leone breaks down into total chaos. He's driven from his village, and he doesn't know if it's the rebels that drove him from his village or if it was the government who drove him from his village. Because all claim to have the authority of the government when they came through. And so even though there's this coup that's taking place, he doesn't know who his elected officials are. He doesn't know who's been given the authority to do what. And so he's driven from his village. And as he goes from his village to other villages seeking shelter, one of the things that he says is that even though he's only a boy, often he's beaten and driven out of the other villages because they don't know if he's a refugee or if he's a spy for the rebels or for the government. There is no trust. And there is absolute massacre and horror and chaos that erupts in the midst of it. We must be able to trust those who have been given authorization to speak and deliver messages that are clear. Test the Spirit. For him, he had no way of testing the Spirit because he was only a boy. Years later, he talks about the United Nations coming in and trying to create stability in that part of the world. And one of the things that he heard over and over again as he went through this rehabilitation treatment, coming out of being a boy soldier, living with post-traumatic stress disorder at the age of 16. The UN workers who sent him the psychologists over and over again, they said to him, "You're a good boy. You deserve to be loved." And at first it made him so angry that he just wanted to erupt, and he got into many fights while he was in his rehabilitation center. But eventually the message sunk in. Yes, I've done horrible things, but I'm still a good boy. Yes, I am worthy of being loved. That message, I believe, was a message from God. That message lines up with the message that John says this morning. That the Spirit of God acknowledges the person of Jesus Christ and acknowledges the love of God rather than the condemnation of God. Although God does use stern discipline at times to correct us when necessary, but as a loving parent uses discipline to correct a child. It's easy for us to be confused by the messages that we hear time and time again, and the instructions that we're given, and how far can we go. Years ago at Yale University, there was a psychology experiment that happened that was dealing with shock therapy. I don't know how many of you have heard of Professor Stanley Morgan.